I'll call to order this meeting of the Salem City Council for Monday, November 18th, 2024. If the recorder will please call the roll.
Counselor Stapleton.
I'm here.
Counselor Nishioka.
Here.
Counselor Phillips.
Here.
Counselor Gwen.
Here.
Counselor Gonzalez.
Here.
Counselor Hoy.
Here.
Counselor Nordyke.
Here.
Counselor Varney.
Here.
Mayor Hoy.
Here. We all join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Councilor Nishioka, do we have a motion for the agenda?
I move for the addition of,
Nope, we're on approval of special meeting agenda.
I move for approval of special meeting agenda.
Second.
Motion by Nishioka, second by Hoy. Anything to add to your motion?
No.
All right. Will the recorder please call the roll?
Counselor Stapleton.
Aye.
Counselor Nishioka.
Aye.
Counselor Phillips.
Aye.
Counselor Gwen.
Aye.
Counselor Gonzalez.
Aye.
Counselor Hoy.
Aye.
Counselor Nordyke.
Aye.
Counselor Varney.
Aye.
Mayor Hoy.
Aye. Motion passes. Councilor Nishioka, we need a motion on the addition to the agenda or revision to the agenda.
Yes, I move to approve the revision of the report on the agenda.
I'll second.
Motion by Nishioka, second by Stapleton. Is there any further discussion?
No, we had a late revision on the report, so that's all we're making that motion on.
Thank you. Will the recorder please call the roll?
Counselor Nishioka.
Aye.
Counselor Phillips.
Aye.
Counselor Gwen.
Aye.
Counselor Gonzalez.
Aye.
Counselor Hoy.
Aye.
Counselor Nordyke.
Aye.
Counselor Varney.
Aye.
Counselor Stapleton.
Aye.
Mayor Hoy.
Aye. Motion passes. All right. Tonight we are here to discuss the Community Violence Reduction Initiative, and I'm going to turn it over to Chief Womack.
There we go. Looks like it all started. Thank you, Mary, Mayor, and councilors. Trevor Womack, Chief of Police. Quickly, I just want to give you all a sincere thank you for being here as elected officials. I don't say that enough, but I see all the work you do, all the information you try to process, all the time you put into meetings, and here I am. We are bringing you back into another meeting, and so I just really appreciate your time and attention to this specific topic that we're talking about tonight, community violence. This is the second work session we've had on this topic. It's been a year, actually. Time goes by quickly. It was last November when we first met on this topic of community violence, which again is more specifically about shootings or serious assaults that occur out in our public spaces, right? Not domestic violence in the home, for example. This is street violence occurring out on our streets, in our parks, in our schools, our shopping centers, usually involving people that may or may not know each other. And sometimes it's a spontaneous dispute that develops and results in violence. So it has a lot to do with shootings specifically. Despite the challenges we face as a community and as a city and as a department since last year, we've made some pretty significant progress in this area, so I'm excited to discuss all that with you tonight. And again, we've done it all without adding more people or capacity to the organization, right? So you're going to see a lot of stuff tonight. A lot of information is going to be presented about ideas and plans to reduce community violence. It's going to be a lot to take in, a lot of information. I would just ask that we all, you all and people in the audience, people watching, just keep an open mind as we talk about these ideas and not be too quick to latch onto a single component or tactic that's mentioned as part of a comprehensive strategy. Because what's needed really is a broad-based comprehensive strategy that includes various components. There's sometimes a risk of, for all of us with our biases or our intuition or our gut feeling about something, about what the right approach is to a problem. And so I would just caution all of us not to do that and to think about the entire package that we're hearing about tonight. For example, I think many of us coming into this meeting might already be asking ourselves, is this gonna be one of those tough on crime approaches? Or is this gonna be one of those soft on crime approaches? And the answer is neither one. This is a smart on crime approach. That's what we're after, a smart on crime approach. So the things we're recommending tonight include both accountability and compassion. And what I mean by that is obviously intervening in crime trends, especially violent crime trends, while holding violent offenders accountable. If you commit violence in our community, held accountable in just and fair ways, but also trying to prevent and intervene before things happen, which a lot of times involves more compassion as far as the resources that are needed to prevent crime. So please think about the entire package here as we go through this, not just one component alone. I know from my personal experience in law enforcement and also from a lot of available research that's out there on how to address this problem, that the most effective strategies include focused efforts by both criminal justice system partners and community-based organization and partners. And so we're going to talk about both of those tonight. In fact, there's a couple attachments that I included in your staff report that are kind of community violence reduction checklists, some best practices that come from DOJ and the COPS office that we're following here. So we're not just making this up as we go, but we are trying to take that best practice information and apply it in a way that makes sense for our own local community also. So because the strategy necessarily involves both community partners and criminal justice system partners, I do quickly want to recognize the partners that have engaged in meaningful ways with us for the past year. Especially for those, I see some in the room tonight, so the folks that showed up tonight, I want to make sure that I mention you. I'll just start scanning the room because that'll help trigger my memory. I see Tim Davis here from Valor Mentoring. Thank you, sir, for the youth mentoring and engagement work you do. I see Eduardo right there. Hello, Eduardo. Thank you for the work you're doing in the the northeast neighborhoods with the events in the parks and so forth, and your work with Seabell. It's been really good to work with you. There's folks here from the Salem Leadership Foundation. I see Sam Skillern, Kyle's here too. They've really stepped up the Salem Leadership Foundation as far as actually leading and coordinating some community components to the strategy already. So I really appreciate that. I also see Pastor Ronnie Brooks from our faith community here. I know, sir, you co-hosted one of our community convenings, and so I appreciate that very much. Who else am I missing on the community side? I don't think Levy Herrera's here, but I know Mano's been at the table. Levy? There you are. Thank you, Levy. Thank you for being at the table with us. I know Mr. Ray White helped co-chair one of our meetings, I think, with you, Kyle. Are you here, Ray? There he is. Ray, thank you again for being here and engaging. Also, Yadira Juarez from Salem Coalition for Equity, the Deputy Director. Is she here? Ah, there you are. Thanks for being here again. Maria Lagos, also from Salem Kaiser Coalition for Equity. Is Maria here? No. Let's see, Suzanne McKenna on my advisory council to the chief has been engaged. Ashish Puri on my advisory council as well. Several members. I think Jane Tichnall might be in the room. What's that? Virtually, she's here virtually. She's with Be Smart, which is about gun safety, safe handling, safe storage. And they're also associated with Moms Demanding Actions. Who've been present at every one of our meetings. They've attended and provided input. Lynn Takata, actively engaged. I think everybody knows Lynn. Thank you, Lynn, for part of your leadership with NAN and for being partners on this effort with us. On the criminal justice system side, we have strong regional law enforcement partnerships, and I just want to call those out. We have in the room with us a couple of close partners. I see Sheriff Nick Hunter from Marion County here, Paige Clarkson, our district attorney on the Marion County side. Thank you both for your leadership. They've been lockstep with us the entire process here for the past year. Also on the other side, on the West Salem side, with Sheriff Garton and DA Felton as well have been partners. A core partner, especially with some of the data and the information we see here with youth engagement in violence, is the Marion County Juvenile Department. Director Troy Gregg has been closely partnered with us. Kaiser PD Chief Andrew Copeland. And we have partnerships at the federal level too that are actively engaged in this specific problem with us very closely with the FBI, the ATF, and the DEA. I just wanted to call out those partnerships that have existed for a while, many of them, but they've definitely been solidified more recently in this past year when we talk about community violence and interrupting the cycle of violence that we're seeing. I want to click through a couple slides here now before I turn this over to the star of the show, Ben McBride. Just to kind of remind us a little bit of background information of how we got here. So the last time we met, we talked about the gun violence problem analysis that we commissioned. We had some outside researchers come in. They took a look at 5 years worth of shooting data in our community, and they called out a lot of information. They interviewed all the detectives on those cases. They looked at all the quantitative data as well, helped us learn some things about where crime is occurring and who's involved and who's at risk. And in fact, in your staff report. I'll take a look at it real quick just because there's a few key points that were mentioned in the staff report that come right out of the gun violence problem analysis. Some of the findings in that report showed that Salem's 10-year average homicide rate is 1 to 2 times greater than the statewide average. That fatal and non-fatal injury shootings doubled over those 5 years they studied from 2018 to 2022, so shootings were on the rise. They also found that gang or group affiliation was identified in about half of all of our shootings, so it's valuable data to have. But also, key here is that the number of active gang members in our community is very small, actually. It's representative of less than 0.01% of our population. It helps you focus limited resources. Same way we can focus is that we know that shootings are concentrated in relatively small geographic areas also, with about 65% of shootings happening in 11% of our city. That's 5 square miles. Helps you focus your resources in the right way. We also learned a lot about individual risk factors, including past criminal history, prior contacts and arrests that lead to increased risk. So all that information is available in that gun violence problem analysis online. We have a web page for the Community Violence Reduction Initiative. The summary that you see on the PowerPoint here is also posted there of that data. So that was foundational for us to begin to develop a strategy, just to understand the problem as best we could, and then to begin to develop a strategy from there. And we talked at that time about what we're going to dive into deeper tonight, kind of the 2 parallel prongs of that strategy that I mentioned earlier too that are important. There's a community component, also the criminal justice system component. And we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So we've been doing all this at the same time for the past year. So while we've been actively engaging our community through a series of meetings to increase awareness, to identify partners and stakeholders, to build some new relationships there, and Empower Initiative helped us with a lot of that work. We've also, on the criminal justice system side, been working hard to balance that accountability and compassion also. So we'll talk about that. So before I hand it off to Mr. McBride, we began the meetings. We held 2 meetings ourselves as a city with police staff and city staff, and the mayor. You helped us kick off that initial meeting at the East Salem Community Center over there. It was about 200 people that showed up for that CVRI kickoff meeting. We began to introduce the data and the information to the community and began to have a conversation and collect their input. What we learned from that meeting immediately was there was a need expressed by our Hispanic community to have more information in Spanish as the primary language. So we followed up a month later in April. City staff, we pulled together a Spanish-speaking only meeting, translated into English, which we did at Chemeketa Community College. So some of the things that we began to learn just from those very initial first 2 meetings, especially from our Hispanic residents, the themes that began to emerge. So we started to hear more about school safety issues and concerns. We began to hear about the perceived lack of resources for youth that are at highest risk. For example, families that have a young man who may be getting into some gang associations or some problems, those families feel like they don't really have many resources to turn to try to intervene in that problem. So that was expressed several times. And collectively, from both meetings, a few of the themes included express concern about neighborhood safety, people feeling safety in their own neighborhoods and blocks and parks where they live. There was a desire expressed for more police presence and patrols. And there was general desire to see more community-based partnerships and faith-based organizations getting involved to create resources for the community. So that's some of the initial input that we began to get from the community. And then we transitioned over, we brought Empower Initiative in, and Mr. Ben McBride's here online as well. And I'll turn it over to him to talk about the continued community input that he did, and he produced a report that he's going to overview for us all tonight. So are you there, Ben?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to be here with you virtually. Thanks, Chief Womack, for your work and the commitment to focus on community partnership to really ensure that Salem and its larger region gets the reduction that we know, certainly all of the leaders here tonight, most of all, we know the families most impacted by violence want to see those results as well. So also offer greetings to all the city leaders here tonight, the opportunity to share some of what we learned and also some recommendations coming out of this summer. So I'm going to take a moment, share my screen. Perfect. All right. So I'm going to be sharing not for a real long amount of time. I'm really wanting to kind of track some highlights from what we experienced this summer. The invitation is for you actually to be trying to think about what are the questions that are coming up for you based upon some of the information that I'll be sharing tonight. Chief Womack actually spoke to several things that I was going to share about. I have plenty to share about, but please be looking for some of the questions that might be unearthing for you. And towards the end of this presentation, I'll pause before handing it back over to Chief Womack to just see if there are any initial questions. And we also might call a little bit of a pivot if Chief wants to wait till we're done with both of our presentations to then circle back around for questions and answer. The other thing I just want to say, this presentation, while brief, is a summation of an 80-page report that we submitted to the police department. And we very much so do recommend all the city council members as well as community members to delve deep into that report and really digest the information that is parsed out there. So it certainly empowers everyone moving forward with great results. Empower Initiative, the organization that I'm with, we've had the privilege and the opportunity of being in these conversations for over a decade in a variety of different ways, thinking about how to support not just conversations about safety, but larger conversations about belonging. And so we say that more to credential ourselves to say that this has not been our first rodeo. We've got a decade of experience where we've seen it work in some cases, and we've seen it fail in many others. And the recommendations that we're going to put forward today, and both are also found in the report, are really rooted in our 10 years of practice, and more so, I would say, in the 20 to 30 years of best practices that are being engaged nationally around this topic. In terms of what we'll go through over the next, let's say, half hour or so, just do another quick top tier about the CVRI approach, just so that we're all on the same page there. And then I'm going to delve into some tactics that we explored through the course of this summer in conversation with community members as a part of the listening session. I'll also bring to you all some highlights from the listening sessions that came this summer with community members, and then move on to the recommendations. As Chief said and defined, what is community violence? I think one of the reasons we continue to drive this point in is because failure to really understand this point leaves many cities making the wrong decisions about how to respond. Community violence is a very specific kind of violence. As Chief spoke to, certainly it is violence that happens on the street, violence that happens outside of the home, violence that often happens between people who don't know each other. But the thing that is really important is to understand that this form of violence has already begun to be treated as a public health issue, a public health disease, which is why the Center of Disease Control has really begun to study and staff the response to community violence, because community violence, as you all know, is oftentimes a reaction to a variety of different factors that are rooted in structural conditions that usually have caused certain groups of people, as the data shows us, Black and brown young men, in the position to be engaged in this kind of violence. I say that not so much to target those communities, but to actually help us recognize that this is a public health issue that is impacting a very specific slice of the community that are experiencing certain kinds of structural realities that isn't the same in every city and community, but certainly shows up in some communities. And so because of the focus in terms of who's impacted, the solutions must be targeted towards the very people who are finding themselves being impacted by the violence. The other point I just want to make is that ignorance around, and when I say ignorance, I mean it respectfully, not understanding community violence has led to a lot of false starts in a lot of cities of people who want to respond to community violence in the way in which they would respond to other kinds of violence, and not using the best practices, particularly about how to respond to community violence that shows up as gun-related community violence. And so it's very important that we follow the science around this practice and what has actually worked through the models where communities and cities have seen a reduction versus the communities where they have not. The other frame I would offer is I want to invite us, as you listen today, to think about community violence as cancer. And I say that with a lot of warmth in my heart for anybody who might be fighting cancer. I have a family member who's also fighting cancer right now. When you're focused on cancer, you don't treat all cancer the same. You treat it in certain kinds of ways. And so in that same way, community violence has to be deeply understood by a city, really responded to with targeted strategies and the necessary investment to get the reduction and save lives and ensure that the epidemic actually decreases rather than increases. This is a data trend that just helps us hold the last 10 years in terms of what is happening across the country as it relates to gun-related homicides. We see that there was a spike. There is a lot of research that's happening. One of the premier names who's doing a lot of the research, his name is Dr. Papachristos, who's out of the central part of the country, who's doing, I believe he's at Northwestern University, is doing a lot of great research to try to understand why violence has spiked in the way in which we're watching it across the country. And so in the same ways, this graph is not too far from the graph if you look at the rise of violence in Salem, according to your problem analysis. There are many people, again, social scientists and others, criminologists, who are trying to understand, where the arc is coming from. The quick answer thus far has been that big shifts that have happened around social life, around resources. Certainly, we can see the pandemic in 2020 through 2022. Many are believing that there, was a big kind of shift and disruption that caused violence to spike. Although over the last couple of years, violence has been on the decrease. And so it is not actually lost on me that Salem could be experiencing right now a little bit of a decrease in some violence, whereas maybe there was a little bit more violence towards the beginning of the year. But I think what's important to keep in mind is thinking about disruptive events. When disruptive events happen to communities that are already predisposed to this epidemic of community gun violence, that is sometimes when the spikes go up. And so as you're listening to the rest of this, I want you to be thinking about, are there any disruptive activities that likely could be on the rise for 2025, particularly for the group at the highest risk to commit an act of violence or be a victim of community violence and gun violence? And if that is the case, then there's going to really be, I think, an invitation to respond rather than waiting for the rise in violence to happen to then try to respond. When we think about CBRI, there are three legs that we believe that the strategy sits on. And this is the way that we would approach it as well for Salem. The first, as you've heard the chief speak to, is to reduce gun violence. Community violence doesn't just focus on gun violence. Community violence is the kind of violence, as we said, that happens between people outside of the home, often between individuals who don't know each other. But the large percentage of community violence is gun violence. And what the work coming out of Center for Disease Control, as well as others, has been that in order to bring down community violence, we should focus on a certain expression of community violence, which is actually the gun violence, the firearm offenses that happen between people who don't know each other outside of the home. And so with the CBRI strategy, one of the main legs needs to be to focus on the gun violence, follow the data, and actually focus resources towards that. The second leg of the strategy must be to reduce recidivism. Many of the algorithms that we've seen in models where people do work around community violence reduction initiatives suggest that firearm offenders are usually repeat offenders. And people who use firearms in relationship to others in community violence either know someone who has been shot recently, they've been shot themselves, or they are in community with people who are shooting. And so putting a focus on those that are actually living in these communities to reduce their likelihood to offend, which is not about suppression. We'll talk about that in a moment. It's really about making them more proximate to resources and support and opportunities. But one of the focuses is not just about reducing gun violence, it's also about reducing people being repeat offenders. And then the third leg of what we've learned over the years is that this only happens if you also are doing this in a way that has a focus on building trust between police and community. And so some might say, well, what does trust building between police and community have to do with reducing community violence? I would encourage you to review the 21st Century Policing Report that was produced about 9 years ago. One of the things that it focused on was something called police trust building and legitimacy. And what they found is that if community members do not see their law enforcement agency as legitimate, they are less likely to actually participate with that local law enforcement agency to resolve crimes and to report crimes when they happen, which actually creates a higher culture of vigilante justice and retribution. So the greater trust and legitimacy a police department has in relationship to the community that is at the highest risk to experience community violence, the higher the likelihood for the law enforcement apparatus to be successful in removing from the community those who are making the choice to be violent and threaten the lives of others within the community. So reducing gun violence, reducing recidivism, and building trust between police and community, these are the 3 legs of a CBRI strategy. I also want to touch then on in the report, and everything I'm sharing is presented in the report with a lot more detail, case studies, hyperlinks of videos that you can watch for those that are more visual learners, as well as data and research that is noted and cited for people who love the science and the data and being able to go to the resources. So again, I'm giving high level, that's in the report, 80-page report. I encourage people to lean into that. For the CBRI tactics, we want to invite us to hold, these are some of the best practice tactics that have been used, and many of them we're going to be speaking to in terms of recommendations for Salem. The first one is engagement. The second is communication. The third is support. And the fourth is safety. So these are the 4 main tactics that we are encouraging to think about a strategy that is functioning, that can actually reduce violence: engagement, communication, support, and safety. In our report, we spoke about the first 3, and tonight we will only speak about the first 3, which is engagement, communication, and support. The safety piece is actually the responsibility in the way in which we think about it in the science and the practice of this work is the role of law enforcement. I believe Chief is going to come behind me, as he just said, to talk about the public safety apparatus contribution to the strategy. What's important to hold is that these strategies are not law enforcement strategies. Now, here's where I want to make a note. In the places where I have seen law enforcement apparatuses try to take on these strategies on their own, so that's both local law enforcement, that could be county sheriffs, et cetera. When I've seen law enforcement apparatuses take this on by themselves, they are oftentimes not successful, and the way in which they show up ends up being suppression and what is experienced by the community as racial profiling. That is not to say that somebody is trying to violate the rights of community members and the citizenry, but the ways in which they show up, if these strategies are not done in partnership with community, they do not happen the way that leaves the community with building trust and the law enforcement agents growing in legitimacy with the community rather than becoming being less legitimate in the eyes of community. So let's first, I want to talk about these. As I said, the chief will talk about enforcement operations, but these 5 areas, when we talk about community violence intervention models, the best practice is to have these 5 activities happening, but all focusing their attention on the groups at the highest risk of committing an act of violence. Now, in every city or region, and the same must happen in Salem, the work has to happen to actually determine who are the groups at the highest risk of violence. Now, this takes a lot of work to do. I know the city has done a problem analysis, came up with some data that the chief presented last year, but that data is not static. That data is dynamic. And this is why there actually has to be a full-time person, which he'll be speak towards the end, who is working regularly with the community and law enforcement to continue to update who are the people that are at the highest risk. And it's not just at the highest risk to commit an act of violence, but it's also those that are at the highest risk to be a victim of violence. Often what we have found is the perpetrator and the person who is the victim are usually the same person. They experience the same level of danger in terms of being a victim of violence. And so a part of this is we have to hold this notion that it's not so much about quote unquote catching the bad guys, because the people at the highest risk to shoot are oftentimes the people at the highest risk to be shot, because usually these are people for a variety of different reasons that are engaged in firearm activity. And that's a whole nother conversation within itself, but it's important for us to recognize we're talking about both groups of those people, both expressions of those people. Out of these things that we encourage us to hold, we talk about night walks and clergy community activities, street outreach, communication, and formal services. And as I said, law enforcement is going to talk about the safety piece. So first I want to talk about engagement. Why is engagement important? What we have found across many cities, and we've experienced this in the listening sessions, which I'll get to in a moment in Salem, is that many community members live a very segregated experience within a particular city. People are not proximate to certain kinds of neighborhoods. And because of that, there is a higher level of anxiety, a higher level of fear, and where there's more anxiety and there's more fear, some of the science, if you look at Dr. Susan Fisk's stereotype content model, she talks about where there's a highest level of suspicion and fear is oftentimes when bias and profiling and behavior that actually is not rooted in truth shows up. And so one of the reasons we say that engagement is important is engagement helps to bring community members, neighbors, citizens, and community members in closer proximity to each other to help people bring down their level of anxiety in relationship to other community members across the city, as well as bringing a presence to certain communities that the data shows that the presence of people in places that are prone to experience community violence or gun violence, whenever you have more people around, the likelihood for that kind of violence to happen goes down. Whenever you bring people who are not a part of a normal community, being in a community, doing events, walking, doing different activities, there is a decrease that happens in that community of criminal acts of violence that happen. And so one of the expressions that we highly encourage about engagement are two that we've talked about in the summer during the listening sessions called community night walks and credible messengers. I will say I'm going to lump some of this together in the essence of time. This was one of the responses that there was a high level of appetite from Salem's community members about something that they could engage in and something that they could do to begin to participate with the community violence reduction strategy. Shout out to Salem Leadership Foundation, and I know other faith leaders and organizations that stepped up to the plate to help to advance this and make this happen. I want to say this, community night walks don't necessarily reduce violence on their own. What they do is they help close the proximity between neighbors and citizens who don't know each other, which creates more positivity and more participation for people to figure out how the resources that they have access to can actually contribute to the problem that we're all trying to solve together. And again, the presence of community members in a certain community helps to drive down criminal behavior within a 1-2 hour period during a more difficult time on a Thursday, Friday, or a Saturday night. There's another expression of engagement, which is credible messengers. With credible messengers, what we're looking for is to find people who are likely more proximate to those who are at a high risk to commit an act of violence or be a victim of violence, and actually to figure out how can we empower them to influence the touches they are already having, to add a message to that about peace and reducing violence that takes advantage of the existing, infrastructure that is already there. Mentoring organizations, schools, boys and girls club spaces, people who already have proximity to those that are at high risk. Could be, reentry programs for young adults who are finding themselves going through that. These are the people where if we can find ways to leverage these institutions, provide some training and some resources, there's a higher likelihood for them to be able to disrupt violence before the violence actually happens. That engagement leads us to the second expression, which is going to be communication. When we talk about communication, it doesn't mean just us talking to each other. It's actually, in order for these strategies to work, there has to be consistent communication vehicles that happen to actually communicate to those that are at the highest risk to commit an act of violence or be a victim of violence, that there are services, there are opportunities, there is a community ready to walk alongside them so that they can step out of the violence, and then have a community that is willing to stay in relationship with them through their reintegration back into healthy society. I want to say something. Somebody said often, nothing stops a bullet like a job. And there is some truth to that. What we've also found in this practice is, it's not just that a job stops a bullet, it's a relationship with someone who actually is going to come alongside somebody who needs to successfully reintegrate into society. One of the best practices that have happened around that is something called the call-in. We talked about this during the listening sessions. This was another thing that community was really energized about. In the call-in session, what happens is you actually bring together those who are at the highest risk to commit an act of violence. These are people that have usually been shooting at each other. Maybe they're on probation or parole. Maybe there is word on the street that, there's violence happening between groups or between individuals. This table is organized. It can be every other month. Usually it's organized quarterly in most cities that we've worked in. And what it does is it brings the people who are actually involved with the violence to the table with law enforcement, with community leaders and faith leaders, with mothers who've lost their children to violence. And it's a time to have targeted communication with those people of messages to let them know that we care about them, that they have to put the guns down. We will help them if they're willing to make those changes, to be very sober with them, to say, if you're not willing to make those changes, you will engage with law enforcement and the consequences that come with that behavior. And we encourage them to actually make a choice away from violence and a choice towards peace. These strategies, where they have been implemented, have been highly, highly successful at getting the right people in a room, getting them the right communication in a targeted way that helps to prevent violence before it's happening or to disrupt violence that potentially could be happening. There's another expression of communication that I touched on in the report that I won't go into deep detail here, but it's called custom notifications. What a custom notification is, very different from call-in communication, is a custom notification. There's two expressions of it. One is something that happens in custody, so partnership with the sheriffs or with the local prisons or jails. You go in and you actually have conversations with individuals when they're in custody before they are released, give them this very targeted messages and actually design their support strategies before they return to the public. The other expression of custom notifications is to engage with individuals with whom we have learned are at a high risk to commit an act of violence and talk to them specifically so that if there is violence that is happening in between the calendar times for call-in communication, you have custom notifications where there's a faith leader, usually a probation or parole officer, and someone who goes to the home of someone or meets at a neutral location, handles this communication and actually helps someone make a different decision. Over the last 10 years, I participated in many custom notifications that saved the lives of the individual that we were talking to and potentially someone else who they were going to do some harm and violence to. The last piece that I want to touch on before getting to some highlights and recommendations and then pausing for questions or throwing it back to the chief is to talk about support. So when we say support, what do we mean? We don't just mean any kind of support. And I want to say it in this way. There are a lot of great nonprofit social service organizations that are doing great work. I'm sure many of them are sitting in the room. Just because an organization is doing great work does not necessarily mean that they are the right organization to do work for those who are at the highest risk to commit an act of violence or be a victim of violence. And so it's important to figure out and determine, and this is another role that a full-time person would help serve and support the strategy, is someone who actually vets organizations to determine who's actually set up or is committed to get on a journey of setting themselves up to have a function and focus for those at the highest risk to commit acts of violence, because these people need very special needs. Here are some of the ways that the best practices have taught us what support looks like. One is incentivized case management. This has been somewhat controversial in different places where people say, why should we reward people to not harm the community? Without getting into a deep values conversation, I would simply say it's the fiscally smart solution. The Center for Disease Control says it's $1 million every time there is a homicide in the city. You could spend a few $1,000s with some incentivized case management, which is about giving people $50 to $100 here or there to begin to make the right choices, getting ID, getting within, moving towards job support, getting them on a track away from violence, away from the relationships that are causing them to perpetuate or be a victim of violence, and being in different kinds of relationships. So having organizations that are already trained and rooted in doing incentivized case management is important. Another expression of support that we've learned that has to be within the ecosystem is relocation. There are some people, by nature of the violence that they might be involved in, need to relocate. And so finding ways to think about the ecosystem that could be in place that doesn't just have to be based on what the city of Salem might be able to offer, but thinking regionally and with regional partners, what might be ways that relocation is also a part of the support strategy. The most common one, job training and placement programs. I think that goes without saying. Mentoring and life coaching, I think that goes without saying. Again, this is another one that we found. Incentivizing those at the highest risk is incredibly important to keep them at the table. Again, we have people that are engaging in violence for a variety of different reasons. Finding ways to incentivize that, to strengthen those relationships, to keep people moving in the right direction is an important investment of time and I would argue money and resources. And then last piece, taking advantage of probation and parole services where they are to find ways to leverage those public services and systems. These tactics that we're offering us are all built out in the report and are what we strongly encourage the council to think about. How is it that these resources, rather than thinking about, okay, we've got to create all these resources and pay for them, it's about how do we mine the existence of these resources within our ecosystem. And I'll speak to that in terms of a next step on how I encourage folks to think about how we get there. Just for a quick moment, and I won't go super deep into this, again, it's in the report, but to just highlight, the listening session, learning and highlights. Some of the biggest, highlights that came up during the 3 summer sessions. We held one with a focus on unsheltered community members as well as unhoused community members. We had another one that was focused again on our Spanish-speaking relatives. And then there was a final one with a focus on faith communities and neighborhoods. And what we heard pretty consistent is that there is a deep psychological trauma that is beginning to happen for people around the violence that is happening in the community. One of the other things that we heard is that the problem analysis actually does not represent the amount of gun violence that is happening, that a lot of gun violence that is happening in certain parts of the city goes unreported and unresponded to, for there wasn't necessarily, any proof or reasons around why. But what there was this notion is people are experiencing a level of shooting and gun violence, whether it's people shooting at each other or whether it's just people engaging with guns in what feels like, an irresponsible way where there are other community members that are feeling at danger, that people are saying that there is a crisis that is happening that people said they felt needs to be responded to. What we also heard from people was that there are still a lot of reasons why people are engaged in community violence and particularly gun violence. They affirmed the report that there wasn't a sense that a lot of it had to do just with group-related violence or gangs, but that there was factors around mental health. There were factors around the notion of younger people, not having the kinds of support and resources that they needed to do. And there was this notion that young people were engaged in gun violence in ways that people felt like they were experiencing, but they didn't necessarily feel like it was showing up in the data. And then there was also some, kind of conversation that we heard through the summer about, there being different expressions of organized crime that was not necessarily always on the radar of law enforcement or others in the community. And there was conversations about some different expressions of crime that started in different places like Woodburn and other places that were disrupted several years ago by some enforcement operations that people were experiencing kind of the outflow of some people that used to be involved in community violence outside of Salem that were now beginning to be involved in that violence within Salem. So there was a lot of concern, and also the notion that the issue of violence needs more understanding within Salem, that it is not as understood as we all would hope that it's understood. But what we did hear from the community was this deep commitment that people actually want to be a part of the strategy. And what we heard is that there was a lot of energy really about two particular expressions. One of those was the call-in. As you heard me share, people really wanted to make a move to figure out, how do we create this table? How do we ensure that we get the people who are most at risk to the table, communicate with them so that we can move them away from violence? And the other piece, which already started, was people saying, we also want to find ways to make sure not only that we keep the community night walks going, but to figure out how to empower more credible messenger expressions and think about what institutions can really begin to build in a certain expression that is really just focused on identifying where the community violence is happening and making sure there are targeted strategies in response to that. So before I move to recommendations, I'll hit, as the chief said, one more time. The community working group was a group that I pulled together after getting a list from Chief Womack about some community partners who had been doing different expressions of work around community violence. We met with them, tried to determine which ones had more proximity and some background around doing some work in relationship to this. We put together a community working group that helped to coordinate the listening sessions and serve as the first expression to bring the community together so that we could hear from the community and come up with some recommendations of next steps. And so here are the recommendations that we have in the report. There are 5 recommendations that are fleshed out there in the report. I want to say this as well. In the report, we offer what is called a 10-10-10 strategy for each recommendation that we offer in the report, which means if the recommendation is taken on, what should you do in the first 10 days? What should you do in the first 10 weeks? And what should you do in the first 10 months? We broke it apart that way so that it actually lays out a plan and a strategy for implementing each one of these recommendations in a way that is sustainable and also manageable. The first recommendation is to implement a community education program around community violence. What we found is that not only do we need to increase the awareness of community members about community violence, we also need to increase the awareness of community members about the resources and find ways to do a deeper and better job of mining the resources that are available in the Salem, Kaiser, Marion, Polk community. What we heard over and over is that there are a lot of duplicative expressions of work, but people don't necessarily know what is actually around to be able to coordinate that together and figure out where should people go for services and resources that can actually disrupt community violence. And so we've got some recommendations, some particular tactics about how to roll out a community education program that's really targeted on making sure that the awareness is targeted where the data says people are at the highest risk to experience violence. The second recommendation, as you've heard me say already, is to implement the call-in communication tactic. We know that there is one barrier that potentially exists for you all. In some cities, the way that you identify who are the people that are at the highest risk is you usually run certain algorithms that are rooted in taking people's criminal record, their exposure, and getting that information from law enforcement partners to determine someone's risk. From what we heard from some law enforcement partners, as well as some community members, that may not be legal in the city of Salem in terms of, or the state of Oregon, in terms of what you all can do. But there is a recommendation where community members, and particularly that community working group, can come up with its own algorithm. What that would look like is you'd have school leaders or community-based organization leaders. You would have faith communities and others determine what are the factors that would cause them to identify this person in our community is at a high risk. And we want to bring them to the table to have a targeted conversation with them about lowering their risk to either be a perpetrator of violence or a victim of violence. So law enforcement does not have to be the partner to create the algorithm that determines the person most at risk. Community can actually play that role. And I think within that, that could resolve any privacy concerns or concerns about an overreach from the state. The third recommendation is to implement the custom notifications tactic. I think this same algorithm, and this is something I think that can happen with law enforcement as well as the algorithm that community members help to develop, is for law enforcement partners, once they have someone in custody, to be able to determine, how to use the algorithm that the community members have developed so that there can be targeted conversations that happen for those that potentially present a risk coming home from being incarcerated, so that there can be specific targeted conversations that happen with people when they're in custody, as well as using that algorithm outside of the call-in calendar. Fourth recommendation, we recommend continuing the night walks and actually thinking about the potential of adding additional night walks. Understanding where the violence is happening and finding ways to flood those areas at the areas where violence is more high with the presence of people and neighbors and community is one of the factors that helps to disrupt violence. And so whether there's the community night walks like the ones that are happening right now, there also can be additional night walks that happen maybe later in the evening and on different days. Don't all have to be big community event type of night walks. Could be more what we call street outreach kind of night walks, where maybe you have 2 to 3 individuals that are walking certain routes in certain neighborhoods, sometimes called a peacekeepers model, that walk certain neighborhoods, and they are there to disrupt and have engagements and conversations with people who might be at a high risk. And then the final recommendation, and to me, this is actually the most important recommendation. I don't see a scenario where many of the other recommendations and things that we've talked about in this presentation can happen without resourcing governance through a full-time position. All of the things that you heard me talk about basically become the function of what a full-time person would do in terms of the connection with the community, the creation of the algorithm for those that are at the highest risk, the person that meets regularly with all of the different partners throughout the city, mining the information, the person that would run the communication education campaign, the person that actually is there to help co-lead the strategy alongside community leaders. And we made some recommendations in the report of some people that are already at the table that we think could help the strategy be successful moving forward, but then also having somebody that works very close to the police department and the sheriff in the county to help ensure that there is coordination happening between law enforcement and with community. We know that the police department tried urgently. I was not a part of that hiring process, but certainly, got those updates through the summer of trying to fill this position to no avail. And there just being challenges with being able to resource this position. I would strongly urge, both community as well as the council and others to think about what has to happen in order to ensure that this position can be filled, whether that's the notion of finding more resources to attract the right kind of talent, but without having someone that's in this position to hold this strategy and bring these pieces together, the chances of the strategy being successful in the ways that we've seen success happen in other places across the country become simply more difficult. I'll wrap up here to say, again, 5 recommendations: implement community education program, implement the call-in tactic, implement a custom notifications tactic, continue night walks and increase their expression, and resource governance, ensuring that community law enforcement are at the table to implement these strategies and continue to do this work in a dynamic way. The report spells this out with a lot more information. I'll pause there, and I think I'm tossing it back over to the chief to talk about the enforcement operation, but then I will stay around for questions.
Ben, why don't we go ahead and see if there's questions now regarding the community side of it?
Thanks, Chief. Do we have questions for Mr. McBride or for the chief? Councilor Hoy.
Thank you. I have a really basic question, but how do you start an algorithm? Is it a survey? How do you get data to start an algorithm?
So this is where the function of bringing in some technical assistance as a part of your strategy will help develop the way that you can build that. That's not my expertise, but there's several people that I could recommend where you could bring in some folks that actually, this is the work that they do. I'm thinking of at least 2 agencies offhand right now, and they will actually work and can find with some creative ways to do some deep listening. There's some surveying that's a part of it. There's also some studying of data. They come from a background in criminology, and they can actually develop that algorithm that helps to determine what are the factors by studying those who've been involved in community gun violence to track the patterns and then to be able to identify and project who are those that are at the highest risk to commit an act of violence. It is not a perfect science. And I will say this, like we did an algorithm process in the city that I was in, and what we found was it was those that were 18 to 35. It was people who were on probation and parole. It was someone who knew someone who had been shot within the last 6 months. It was someone who was a previous firearm offender. And there was one more factor that I can't remember offhand, and it's somewhat of a dragnet strategy. The challenge of that is there were moments where we did pull in people who said, I'm not even active right now. Why am I being called into this call in? It's not perfect, but what we found is we got more of the people to the table. And even when we invited to the table those who weren't active, we still provided the opportunity for them to get support and resources. And so while there was somewhat of a disruptive night, maybe being invited to the call in, feeling like they're a part of a conversation that they don't feel they should be at the table, we felt by playing those numbers and having enough of those right conversations, at best, we were able to help reduce violence. So there's a couple resources and firms that I could certainly pass off to the chief if you are interested in taking the next step.
Thank you. And I think what you're talking about essentially, Mr. McBride, is a risk assessment tool. And I know that the sheriff has access to, he has people on his staff who have that skill and also have access to experts in the field. So I know that's an area that at parole and probation that they work with every day. And that's really their area of expertise in our community is the sheriff's office, specifically parole and probation. So, yeah, Councilor Stapleton.
Thank you so much. Quick question here. You mentioned some case management and the mentoring or life coaching, and I'm wondering if we have any organizations here in the area that qualify to do this work already.
Yeah, so a part of what we weren't able to do, it wasn't necessarily a part of our contract this summer in terms of being able to do the mining of the resources that are there. But what we did learn in some of the sharing is that there are some organizations that are already proximate to some of these communities. Amano, I believe I'm saying the organization's name correctly, has different expressions of programs and services that are already proximate to those at the highest risk to either commit an act of violence or be a victim of violence. And so rather than resourcing organizations that would need to try to find the relationships in the community, I think leaning on an organization that is already in relationship with these communities and allowing them to direct people in the right direction would be the best way. I know Levy has some thoughts about this in terms of other organizations that he could recommend as well. In the report, I make some recommendations for that to be one of the launch points.
Great, thank you so much.
Additional questions for Mr. McBride? Councilor Gonzalez.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. McBride, for the report. I read the report, and what I like is Kyle and Levy, as people leading it. So I love that that's in there. But the question I had is, what makes this report, Salem's report, and the recommendations unique? Like, what's the difference between our report and the reports we've done for other cities?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think you all's report is really based around the notion of the reality that you don't have a group gain issue according to the data, which means that your approach can't follow the normal practice of a CVRI model that's identifying groups. Your model is one that actually is going to have to go a couple degrees deeper and really mine out the relationships of people that are more at risk, which means you're going to have to take a deeper relational strategy rather than just an organizational strategy where you're identifying groups. It also means that a law enforcement approach towards this is going to have to be a little bit slower because you don't have a big network of groups or gangs. If you don't take a very targeted relational model, what could happen is a suppression strategy that is experienced by people is a lot of racial profiling. People being targeted because they feel like they fit a certain profile because people are trying to figure out who are the people that are at risk. And so I think what you all will need to do, and what's different about it to me, is you all will really have to take a real relational model and actually use your resources to support more relational work than just supporting more organizational rollout of strategy.
Yeah, and a follow-up, the recommendations, though, report to report, are they pretty much the same?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think some reports, it all depends on a city, right? For example, when we were doing work in the city of Oakland, its recommendations had to be very focused on the way that things were showing up in that city. It wasn't across the city, it had to be focused in one very specific area. The group was different, so we didn't include, for example, schools, or you didn't include youth mentoring expressions, because the way that you would respond to violence around young people is different from the way that you're going to respond to violence around middle-aged adults. There are some basic, kind of practices and learnings across the board that are just standard, and I think the real implementation is where you really dig in and do the fine-tuning to make sure that it fits. What we found, though, is when people commit to these strategies, there has to be a real commitment. At minimum, we say people need to commit 3 to 5 years in order to see real sustainable change.
Sounds good. No, and I guess the last thing I want to mention is just something I wanted to add to the section where it talks about partnering with the Salem Chamber of Commerce, and because it talks about people coming out of jail, reducing recidivism. But you also, I'd like to see, at least for our city, some efforts for teen employment. My son was 15. We couldn't really figure out how to find him a job other than just trying to go online. And if it wasn't for a Facebook post that someone at Wallery's announced, we wouldn't have known that job was available. And it was really structured to teens. It's It's set up, so it's a little bit after school. It's not too late. It's X amount of hours. It really fits the teen, and I think hopefully we can partner up with the chamber for to find more employment opportunities for teens, because it got him out of the house, and he stands up a little taller, little different because of that. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing I just would say to that, just to keep the focus on those that are at the highest at risk, I totally agree with you around the notion of employment and the role of the business community. I didn't say it when we talk about the call-in, but I believe it's in the report. Where the call-ins have been successful is when we actually have the business community also there at the call-in time that night to actually create relationships and opportunities to move those at the highest risk directly into employment opportunities. And so what we found in certain cities is we bring business owners and people to the table that are actually ready to offer second chance employment that night when we do the call-in. So this notion of getting everybody across difference to show up and bring their unique contribution is what usually yields the success.
Are there additional questions for Mr. McBride? Councilor Nordyke.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Mr. McBride, for all your work and for all the community partners who are present tonight for all your work as well. Just a comment at this point, and then I look forward to hearing from my colleagues and then from our chief again. I have appreciated that from the start, our chief has made clear that law enforcement is a piece of this, but not the entirety. And I feel like that really needs to be said, that when you looked at that approach that you have, these tactics, when you look at how to serve these high-risk populations, law enforcement needs to be at the table, but so do all of these other groups. I was listening to the news before our meeting began tonight, talking about how food insecurity is worsening. And people probably don't think of food insecurity having a link to community violence. But to me, I remember participating in one of these sessions. It was the one out at the Seymour Center by Catholic Community Services. And a lot of folks talking about these social determinants of health impacting decisions for kids to get into gangs instead of getting an after-school job or getting involved with sports if they can afford to play in sports. So I just wanted to say thank you for the fact that, yes, we must have enforcement. Yes, we must have accountability. But I think we really want to truly reduce community violence. It's going to have to involve all of these tactics for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Are there additional questions? All right, Chief, I think we're ready to move on, unless Councilor Nishioka was going to turn that look into a question. Okay, it'll wait. So go ahead, Chief.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McBride, for the report. The good questions. This is what I was hoping for, too, to get some questions, hear some input from the councilors. Community engagement for us involves our elected leaders, right, as representatives of our community. So it's important to have this conversation here tonight. I'm looking at, and staff, I think we're looking for a little bit of guidance and direction. What stands out as something encouraging or promising that you think we should pursue? What maybe won't fit, right? So having this conversation is very important. The recommendations that Ben brings forward, maybe they don't all work for Salem. Maybe they need to be tailored more for Salem. And that's what we need to work on next. I did want to say now I'm going to start transitioning over to away from that community piece of the strategy to talk more about the law enforcement collaboration that's happened as well. There's this idea or this concept of focused deterrence. It's well researched too. You can Google it and read about it, but it's really about taking a targeted law enforcement approach. So you're not just casting a big net across your community, for example. Let's just arrest as many people as possible. Let's just stop as many people as possible to suppress violence. That's the old way of thinking of this problem, and now it's much more targeted. How do we identify the folks who are actually at the highest risk of committing violence and try to intervene? And then how do we just only target the folks that are actually violent offenders for that law enforcement piece? That's the focused deterrence piece that we're after, right? Much more laser focused in our community, and that serves to build trusting relationships when we take that sort of approach also. So we're taking a focused approach, deterrence approach model. We've been working with our partners on how to do that, calling violence out as a priority for all of us and coordinating and communicating in really good ways around that. And so I'd like to turn it over to Deputy Chief Debbie Aguilar, who's been leading this part of the strategy for us, just to overview some of the work that we've been doing for the past year in this area. Thank you, Debbie.
All right, thank you. Good evening. So for the record, my name is Debbie Aguilar. I'm a Deputy Chief with Salem Police Department. And tonight I'm going to talk about the public safety efforts of the CVRI. This is just going to be a high-level overview. You have much more information in your staff report. And actually, the Chief did a really good job of talking about focused deterrence. So really, when we look at our strategies for violence reduction, we're talking about focused deterrence. And what is focused deterrence was really about area-based and person-based risk reduction. So identifying locations that are at high risk for community violence, identifying individuals who are high risk for either perpetrating or being victimized by community violence, and then figuring out how to reduce that risk. So you're going to see examples of both of those when I talk about some of the initiatives that we have going on in our public safety efforts. So the first one I'm going to talk about is our ICAP, or our Intelligence, Communication, and Planning. That's a monthly meeting where we use data to determine or identify areas in our community that are high risk for violence, and then we focus our department resources on that area. We're not just looking at enforcement as well, we're really looking at community engagement, engaging with businesses, visibility, all to help reduce that risk of violence in that part of the community. There we go. So our next effort that we have is our youth violence prevention and intervention. This is a new way that we wanted to try to collaborate during the summertime to drive down that risk of community violence during the summer. It really focused on police visibility, on uniformed officers driving marked patrol cars and going to areas that were at high risk for community violence and being visible, engaging with the community, engaging again with business owners. Much of the work that we did in relation to that visible patrol was on overtime, because we also recognized that we didn't want to negatively impact our patrol response for calls for service, and we recognized that we did have some staffing challenges this summer. So like I said, that really was focused on community engagement as well as that visibility. Those were the primary goals of that additional patrol response. What I will say, though, is that there was an enforcement component as well. Also, in line with the youth violence prevention intervention, we also partnered with the Marion County Sheriff's Department, their community corrections, as well as the juvenile department. We paired officers with POs and had them go out in pairs to conduct home visits, check in with families, both with youth who are on supervision as well as adults. And then we also had them out in the community making community contacts with individuals who are on supervision. We are actually one of the only police departments in the area that has a NIBIN machine and a NIBIN analyst. And NIBIN is short for National Integrated Ballistics Information Network. And I will point out that both the NIBIN machine and the NIBIN analyst are both grant funded, so we don't have to pay for those. The Oregon, Idaho, HIDA, the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program, partnered with us and provided us grant money to supplement, to pay for those, the machine and the analyst. But the NIBIN is important because it analyzes gun casings to link crime gun evidence from crime scenes in and around Salem. Also, connected with that closely is our partnership with the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearm, with their initiative to create a Crime Gun Intelligence Center, or a CGIC. And again, the CGIC is really meant to be regionally allow law enforcement to link crime guns and people across the region and potentially across the nation. So we do have some additional technology, our automated license plate reader program, or ALPR. It's actually a program that's been around for quite a while, but we do think that it's important to highlight that because that does allow us as to use it as an investigative tool to identify vehicles when they're used during the commission of a crime. And then we have to also mention our crime analysts. So as you've heard, much, if not all of this work is really data driven. And so we need to have personnel who can take all of this information, analyze it, and provide us with the data to inform the work. And so we do have 2 full-time crime analysts who work really hard behind the scene in providing us with that data to help focus our efforts. So we do also recognize that funding is needed for a sustainable and long-term approach for community violence. Right now, we are sustaining our CVRI work just through our regular budget without any additional funding. But we also do recognize that in order to fund a lot of the programs that we would like, it really does help to have some additional funding streams. We did apply for several grants. Although we recognize that grants aren't perfect, they're usually short-term funds, and sometimes there are some limitations to using the funds, but we still thought that it would be valuable to apply for several grants to help fund some of our additional work. We were successful in 2 of the grants that are listed on the slide. The first one is Project Safe Neighborhood Grant. That grant will pay for additional training and technology for officers involved in the CVRI work. The exciting part about that grant is that it also allows us to provide a sub-grant to the Salem-Keizer Public School District to help fund their youth violence prevention and intervention programming. The second grant that we were awarded is a trust building micro grant, and that grant is really to help enhance and measure our trust building efforts. We have 2 more grants that we applied for that we're still waiting to hear back on. One is a federal appropriations. That one would pay for additional police department staff to focus on the CVRI work. That one is dependent on the federal budget approval and adoption. The last grant is a fairly large grant that's through the Department of Justice. That one would be a 3-year grant. It is a large grant, but it's also a very competitive grant. If we were to be awarded this grant, it would, again, help fund some additional police department positions for the CVRA effort, as well as, like Mr. McBride mentioned, with that Office of Violence Prevention Manager position, this grant could potentially help pay at least for 3 years for that position. And now I will turn it back to the chief.
Thank you, Debbie. Okay, I just touch on a few more slides here as we get closer to the end. We talk about the work that we're doing on the criminal justice side, specifically on that accountability side. We are still very, very good at what we do with our criminal justice partners, as far as if you do pick up a gun in Salem and use it in a criminal way, then we're actually very good at following up on those cases and solving those cases. And we are being as transparent and trying to communicate as much of that as to the community. So you'll see us putting out press releases. There's 5 or 6 examples listed in the staff report. I have 3 of them up here on the screen where we communicated some arrests that we had made through good follow-up. One in July where 2 suspects were arrested for attempted murder in Northeast Salem with a gun. And then in August, a young adult was arrested for a downtown shooting of a local teen. More recently in October, some follow-up from a shooting that occurred all the way back in July. We've been actively working. We were able to arrest 2 people for the commission of that crime and actually seize the gun was involved as well. So we're continually following up on our cases. I've talked about this before. For example, our homicide clearance rate for Salem PD is always upwards of 90 to 100%, whereas the national average is at 58 right now. So we are very good at following up on crimes and solving violent crime in our community, and we're going to continue to do that work, and it's because of the partnerships we have as well. This slide, before I even mention these stats, I want to say that we had them wrong in the first staff report. I have to just call that out right now. So we issued a follow-up staff report that was corrected. The numbers aren't quite as grand as they looked in that original one. And our media, too, I know that I apologize because there was some incorrect information initially went out, but we've since corrected that. And this was just simply human error, carrying over the wrong numbers into the report. So, but this is accurate. We fixed it this morning. So just a quick look at some of the data. We're tracking all the shootings that are happening on a near real-time basis, and it looks so far gun homicides have reduced a bit. We have one fewer gun homicide this year than we did in 2023 at this time, and we have a couple fewer shootings. People that got shot that survived their injuries, non-fatal injury shootings, are down a bit this year also. But I've also talked for several years now that it's much less important to look at year-to-year comparisons, especially if you look at the longer-term trend line for homicide. You see a graph that literally looks like just a jagged line, because you can go from one year to have one person shot and killed in your community to the next year having 5, and then back down to 2. And so it goes up and down regularly. So it's much more important to step back and look at a 5, 10, 15-year window and look at the long-term trend lines. And so that's what we're after here. There's no telling if this is the start of a longer-term trend line. I hope it is, but it's also a signal that it's not a time to back off at all. We need to keep doubling down our efforts and go after those long-term sustainable reductions that we're after. And that's why, like I said before, the comprehensive strategy is so important, so we can keep pushing these numbers downward. So that's all of the slides, I believe. I think to try to wrap up and close out, I'm really curious if there are more questions or input on anything that Deputy Chief Aguilar or we have talked about, or anything from Ben McBride still. Questions that we can answer, even just reactions or thoughts or feedback are helpful to help guide some of our next steps going forward. So,
Well,
Mayor?
thank you, Chief, for this. I think it's been great information. It's exactly what I had hoped for when we started this whole process. I would like to just chat in a kind of, you and I have had this conversation, and I've had it with other staff, but I'd like to just have a little bit of a public dialogue about what are we going to do about this position that we can't seem to hire? What's the real path forward to actually making that happen?
And that's one of the points I wanted to emphasize. The takeaway from all of this tonight is the need for some sort of coordination position, especially on the community-based side. The criminal justice collaboration that's going to happen is going to continue going, but to further some of that community-based work, it's going to take some sort of linchpin position, whether that's a full-time city employee, which I think is the best approach outside of the police department, though, so there's some disconnect or separation from the criminal justice side, or whether that ends up being a partner organization in the community that picks up that sort of coordination role, but that's going to be critical. How do we make it happen? I think we created a temporary position. Part of the problem here is we created a limited duration position for 18 months, I believe, using salary savings. And so to attract a high-quality candidate to take a job that's temporary in a city that's talking about budget cuts and layoffs and so forth is almost impossible. And so we've tried 2 recruitments. Those failed. People didn't accept those positions for those reasons. We did have qualified applicants. So there are folks out there ready to do this work that I think are highly qualified. So we need to get a permanently funded position that folks can count on. It's paid at a well rate, and that we can bring quality applicants in. I don't know what the answer to that is. We're going into our budget season now, and frankly, it's hard to talk about adding any new position to the city at this point. But I think that is critical moving forward with especially the community side of this work.
Thank you. Other questions for the chief? Councilor Hoy.
Thank you. It was mentioned there was a grant for $2 million. Is that each year, or is that a one-time grant?
The total is $2 million. It would be over a 3-year period.
Okay. And can that be used for people?
It could be used to fund this position.
Okay. Thank you.
But typically, that's not recommended. It could be, but it would be 3 years. So you would find yourself in the same position where it either ends or we have to fund it through the general fund or some other way. And so there's always a risk with accepting those grants, but at least the amount was enough for 3 years. It's unusual for that amount, actually, that we could at least fund positions for a few years and hopefully have a long-term solution in the meantime.
Sure.
And when will you know about that?
We should know any day, really. I mean, we're just waiting to hear back. Typically, you do find out October, November on the results of these awards, and so we're just waiting to see. Yeah.
Other questions for the chief? Councilor Gonzalez.
Thank you, Chief. I know you guys work in the real world, so to have to put it in documents and stats, I really appreciate you guys doing this. Good luck on the future grants. Congrats on the grants you got. I want to ask, how do you define positive community contacts? Is that positive from our side, from the people what does that mean actually, just so I know what it means?
They're definitely not arrest situations. That's one category. But I'll actually have Debbie talk to it. So as part of that, we captured data as part of that Summer Youth Initiative. And so I'll have Debbie talk about that. Thank you, Debbie.
Yeah, so we identify that as when officers are contacting community members and there's no call for service necessarily. It's just an interaction that's positive. I might be passing out stickers. It might be officers playing a pickup game of basketball with kids, going into a business and just opening up a conversation about their concerns. So there's no, like the chief pointed out, there's no crime attached. There's no any kind of I suppose stress around the contact. It would be considered positive, and I would hope that it would be positive on both the community side as well as the police department side.
And the general idea there, is that just to balance both, right? So we want to make sure that we're not going into a neighborhood at high risk and just casting that wide net through enforcement operations only. We want to make sure that we're there doing targeted enforcement where it makes sense, but then also just spending time building relationships and trust with our community at the same time. So that's the idea. What you measure is what matters, and what you measure is what happens. And so we encourage our officers to make positive contacts and not just consider themselves in a law enforcement mode all the time.
Thank you for that. On the youth violence prevention intervention, some of this is already going on, and so I appreciate, because you said when you present this, what does it trigger? And there was Marion County, someone in the Marion County Probation's office. He was working with a youth, and somehow the conversation got brought up that he's interested in small business. He reached out to an organization I volunteer with. It's small business entrepreneurship. He brought him to a meeting, and I took care of the kid. I said, I'll introduce you. This is how you introduce yourself. You need to go ask for business cards, set up coffee with these people that you want to eventually become. And he brought him to 2 meetings, showed up, bright kid. And then I ran into him in Woodburn. I just happened to run into him, and he waved, said hi to me, and his dad's like, who's this guy? And he sort of told him who I was, and he just thanked me. So it was, these connections, these relationships really do matter. And that's just one example that happened earlier this year. So so it's good.
Thank you for that example. So there are resources and there are good things happening in our community already. That's also why I think that coordinator position is so important, because if we're going to focus in on community violence and the small subset of our population that's highest risk for being involved in a shooting or being shot, then you have to have that coordinator that understands that entire environment of the resources that are out there and how to quickly connect people in the right ways. Just be more intentional about that. So we obviously need to leverage the existing resources as best as possible, which is going to take some sort of centralized coordination.
Any additional questions? Councilor Varney.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I really appreciate, I'm thankful for the sub-grant to support the school district's efforts to aid in this. I think all the different areas we can come from, that's great. I did have a grant question about the, what is it, the NIBIN grant? Is that what it is? Is it 1 year, or is it ongoing funding, or what is it?
That's actually ongoing funding. When I say it's a grant, it's not like we didn't apply for it. We have a partnership with HIDA, and so they are providing us that money. As long as we're willing to have the NIBIN machine and the NIBIN analyst, then they'll fund that. So it's not a grant where it's going to end unless we choose to end the relationship.
Okay, no, that's great news.
I'll add there too, the benefit for the other organizations is we become a hub for NIBIN. So there's only 2 in all of Oregon. There's only 2 agencies that are NIBIN hubs, and we're one of them. So we take in casings and evidence from other agencies and other jurisdictions, and we process it through the system as well, not just our own cases. And so that's the benefit of them providing the information or the resources to us, is because we also process the evidence for the broader region.
Now that's fantastic, an information investment, in other words. Right. So if we can't immediately hire someone for this position, if we can't do all the recommendations at once, what piece or tactic or strategy should we emphasize? What would have the greatest initial effect?
this is rough because there's so much to do in Ben's recommendations that take some more investment and coordination, but there are some things happening already. So there are night walks already happening. So I think, and they don't cost a single tax dollar. They don't cost any of my resources. These are just community-based efforts that are already happening. So I think as a community or as a city, we want to encourage that as much as we possibly can to continue happening. And so I really appreciate the work by Salem Leadership Foundation and just taking a leadership role there and helping to coordinate those events. Anything we can do to increase positive presence in neighborhoods lowers risk. And as Mr. McBride talked about, it has the side benefit of bringing people together and establishing new relationships and strengthening community. And again, that doesn't cost our tax dollars to do that. So that's one area where I think we should encourage that as best we can to keep happening.
That makes sense. Can I ask one more?
Sure.
About recidivism rates. I'm curious, and you probably, I don't know if you have any figures, but how do those that are involved in community violence, how do those recidivism rates compare to just the overall recidivism rate?
I don't have all the answers offhand.
Just
it's
curious.
part of the rest of the system with me too that would need to speak to that. And I do think there's also some more analysis coming from the county. So the county also, the sheriff specifically, commissioned another gun violence problem analysis for a 10-year period with a little more deep information in it. That's coming out within the next couple months or so. So we'll have some more data to draw from for the strategy. But there's other partners I think that we do need to engage, whether it's at the state level, for example, with Oregon Youth Authority, and kids that are being released from Oregon Youth Authority and what sort of services they have, what their recidivism rates are. I can't say it either, thank you. So I think we need to look into that data more, but I don't have it off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
That brings up a question I actually wanted to ask Chief, and that it might be best asked to the sheriff. But, last year when we convened, we were really talking about, the county was talking about the work that they were going to initiate. And of course, living in East Salem, that's something that's always on my mind because of the sort of porous, fluid border out there. So I'm wondering, Sheriff, if you wanted to just chat with us for a moment, maybe give us an update on where you're at with this process, if you could, or if you, I don't want to put you on the spot. Actually, I do.
It's not necessarily a new thing.
Yeah.
So, now it's going to get really loud with me.
There you go.
So a little bit of what we ended up doing, we took a bigger look. We looked at 10 years. We also looked at some different sort of predicate offenses or nexus offenses to gun violence. One of the things we found is it's a bit complicated for Lisa, the same person, to put together that info for us. And we keep coming back to her with questions. Like, I know one of the questions has been specifically in East Salem. What does that look like between unincorporated and incorporated? And right now, it's all captured. So right now, unfortunately, I will tell you, if I read you the data right now, it makes Salem look like you have the entirety of the problem. And we know that is not true because we know there's an unincorporated piece and an incorporated piece. So we've asked them to go back and do a few additional details for us so that we can really vet that out, because that's where we started. So I say all that to say there's been some delays. We are still looking at potentially December as being able to release this. I've been working with the DA, I've been working with the chief. So some of the initial we've looked at, anecdotally, you're seeing a lot of the same things. I think we're bringing in some additional areas, and I will tell you that this one has 11% or 11%, and we get to differently 11 square miles to 22 square miles or something when we bring in the Marion County data. Still a very small portion of what the overall square miles in Marion County are, but it does start to bring in some additional areas like Woodburn. And what are we seeing out of Woodburn? I know Mr. McBride brought it up that he was talking about folks coming out of Woodburn and ending up in Salem. If you look at our data set, it's going to tell you that there are still things going on in Woodburn and it hasn't left there. So we do know that Northeast Salem has become more of a playing field. Not everyone lives in that area, but these are the directions that we want to go. The chief brings up good points about this summer. This summer, what was great was, and I'm going to take a little bit just to address a couple of those questions. But when we looked at the POs, so the POs were from the Special Services Group. And so when we talk about high-risk offenders, the question just came up about recidivism. I can't give you the exact rate. Some of those recidivism rates are going to change depending on the classification of those offenders and who those offenders are. But one of the things when it comes to a positive contact doesn't, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes here, but it doesn't have to end with a sticker. A positive contact can be getting out, there we go, getting out into that community and engaging with those folks that wouldn't otherwise want to engage. And the first time they engage, it may not be what you would think is a positive contact. But if we can continue that, because we know that to get to influence and persuasion, which is what we want to get to change, we've got to build rapport. And Mr. McBride talked about it. And what does rapport actually look like? And we don't want to have that. We want to have an authenticity in that conversation. And authentic conversations sometimes start very rough. They start very rough. But persistence in that conversation is where that authenticity prevails and where that trust actually starts to get built. So although you do want that instant sort of, yes, this is positive, I think that there is a road of diligence that gets you to positive at times to get to the rapport, to get to influence and persuasion. And we know, I think, what we're going to really focus on when it comes to our side of this. And we've had, again, a lot of conversations with the chief, a lot of conversations with Chief Copeland as well, because it's going to be a big effort to make this work. But we're seeing more and more of that juvenile data. And what does it say about our younger community? How do we get our younger community, I know Tim's been sitting over here nice and quiet, but how do we get Tim and Valor Mentoring really involved in this and give them a new pathway, give them a new challenge that they want to get into this community and do? I think that's where we're really going to have to start is, yes, there's a law enforcement component, there's a community component, there's us working together, but we've got to find new ways to establish rapport with a community that right now we don't necessarily have the rapport with to create that influence and persuasion to change.
Thanks, Sheriff.
Yep.
Appreciate it. And while we have our DA here, I would like to give her the opportunity to come up, and I'm going to give her the opportunity by asking her a question. You and I have had this conversation in the past, but I just want to, it's probably the last time I'm going to get to ask you a question publicly, so I just want to put it out there. This isn't a gotcha, but I really want to, this is a persuasion in the form of a question. I'm really hoping you will consider starting to name gun manufacturers by name when we put out information about shootings. I know that there's a national strategy that says that trying to bring pressure from the national level on gun manufacturers to take steps to be a part of the solution to this problem, and naming them by name is part of that strategy, and I really hope you'll consider doing that. I've talked to the chief about it. I'm really hoping that you will consider publicly naming those manufacturers.
I did not hear a question, but
I
thank
hope you'll
you.
consider. That's a question.
I will happily consider it. Thank you, and that's something we can talk about from a law enforcement perspective.
Great.
Obviously, any strategy, Mr. Mayor, thank you for bringing that forward, is something we want to look at here, and that's I think why we're in this position, is we're all trying to figure out creative ways to get to that influence and persuasion, and really tested ways to hold those people accountable who deserve to be held accountable. So we can have those conversations. But thanks for the persuasion in the form of a pseudo question.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for indulging it. Are there any other questions for any of the folks? Councilor Varney.
Thank you. One thing that wasn't mentioned, I'm curious about, what about peer mentor programs? I'm just kind of curious because we didn't talk about them.
Thank you. Yeah, so Mr. McBride referred to credible messengers. This is something that I wanted to mention, actually, so thanks for the question. I do think that's a critical component. We talked about influence and building relationships, and so the best example that I can kind of bring this home to would be what already exists with our lead navigators, law enforcement assisted diversion. So when you think of addiction, for example, and how it interplays with unsheltered population, homeless, and some of those problems, it's proven effective to have peer mentors with lived experience come along folks in their addiction and begin to help them make the right decisions towards coming away from their addiction, right? The same logic applies to violence too. So folks that are credible messengers in that sense, that maybe have some sort of lived experience, they've been closer to the violence themselves as peer mentors to help folks make the right decisions. And I think the sheriff mentioned maybe, asking some of our partners to step up and engage in some of this work, and it's going to take funding and resources for that too, but finding a way to create more credible messengers in the community that we can refer folks to and build relationships with to help them make the right decisions. I think that's important. Yeah.
Councilor Nordyke.
Thank you so much. I heard reference to community violence and gun violence being public health problems, and I wholeheartedly agree. But when I did a quick keyword search of the report, I don't see the words public health in the report. And I just want to reiterate the fact that there is a lot that community public health departments, i.e. county public health departments, can do. There's a lot of research out there that if you have under-resourced neighborhoods with higher concentrations of poverty, a lack of economic opportunity, a lack of upward mobility, communities that get left behind, they are more likely to resort to violence. And when I'm not in the room tonight, I'm at home tonight, but where is our county public health departments in this conversation? Because to me, a lot of what these recommendations are about should and can involve our county health officials. For example, you talk about a community and education program. Public education is what public health county departments are all about. And there may be other departments, divisions, sections, et cetera, within the county that can be helping us and should be, frankly, helping us in this conversation. The city doesn't have a public health department. And our taxpayer dollars go towards the county as well as to the city. So to me, Marion County government must be a part of this conversation and not just parts outside of Salem. I mean inside Salem, everything that is within the geographic boundary of Marion County. And that includes the incorporated parts of Salem where we have the highest rates of crime. So I don't know if any of those individuals are present, but when we talk about getting folks to step up and participate in this effort and work together, this cannot be in the city of Salem's shoulders alone. We cannot do this alone. We cannot afford to do it alone, and it will not be effective if we try to do it alone. So I would really love to hear what role the county government is going to be playing in this, and not just the sheriff's office, not just the enforcement side of things, but what is the county going to do to help us prevent this from happening in the first place?
Chief, do you have anything on that?
I can't speak for the county government, but we do have some close relationships working with the county. We've had conversations with Salem Health as well about how we might approach this problem together. So I do see it as a public health issue as well. There's interventions that can take place in the emergency room immediately after a shooting, for example. That's that public health connection that we're talking about, whether it's a risk assessment tool, things like that. So we want to explore all those options. Again, that's not going to be me or my department probably doing that work. It's going to be some sort of coordinator position that's able to bring partners together and create the relationships and have those conversations. But I really appreciate the comments because it's the feedback that we need to hear as far as the directions we need to continue to explore.
Thank you, Chief. Councilor Gwynn.
So I was curious, rather than like a coordinator position, have you thought about like hiring a Valor Mentoring that could bring in City of Kaiser and Marion County and all of these partners and Salem Leadership Foundation and all of these partners together?
I think that's generally the two ideas I was talking about. So it's got to be some sort of linchpin coordinating person or organization. So either that's a city staffer that we fund, again, outside of the police department, or it's grant or city money directed towards a nonprofit partner that could do that work for us. I don't think there's too many other options, but basically that's probably how it would need to be structured. Still, it requires sustainable funding.
Councilor Nishioka.
Thank you, Mayor Hoy. And I too want to thank all of the community partners that are here tonight that have been working on this. We all really appreciate all the work that you've done and hope that you will continue your efforts because it is needed. Something that I wanted to add is coming partly from what Councilor Nordyke said, and something said by Councilor Hoy earlier today to me, is after we hopefully can find funding for the one-person coordinator, which will be a big job, I think too, I would like to have a call out to our, to the county, private businesses support with the idea of potentially having a community center in that area, and a community center that then could be at the place for people to go to have resources. And what I've highlighted a lot in my report here is the arts projects, things that people could get involved in, whether that be illustrating art or dance or other things, that there could be activities that they were participating in to bring joy, and I think that would help reduce the crime. So anyway, that's what I would be pushing for. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Councilor. That's actually a conversation that Levy Herrera and I have been having for a while now, just about that very thing, is having a community center out in East or Northeast Salem. So yeah, Councilor Stapleton.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody who's provided so much great information tonight. I wanted to comment on a few different areas just to provide a little bit of feedback. I agree with my colleagues, especially Councilor Nordyke, when we talk about this as a public health issue. You and I have talked about this many, many times. And the idea that we as a city cannot do this alone, that we need our partners. And we need to continue the conversations about funding. I know this is critical. It has been critical even before I ran for office. Very frustrated that we haven't been able to come together as a community to find a path forward on this, but hopeful that that will come in the future, because I really see us on the brink of being able to capture this momentum in a positive way and really create a lot of positive outcomes for our community, or really having to put it on the back burner as a city and really count on our community to carry the work forward if we are unable to do so. And I agree with you 100% that we need to have that position outside of the department to ensure that we have some separation there. So thank you so much for your work, and I really hope that this continues on with a lot of good blessings for the community, for sure.
Thank you, Councilor Hoy.
Thank you. I'm curious about the relationship with Salem Kaiser Public Schools and what that might look like without SROs, or with some form of an SRO maybe might be a thing, that, because from my experience, those folks tended to have more information about what's going on in the lives of the people at school. So what does a partnership with Salem Kaiser Public Schools look like without that?
It definitely looks different, but it's still high quality in my mind. So we don't have the direct connection as far as a police officer in the classroom or in the schools anymore. They would have additional information about things that are going on. They understand the students where they are in their life more because they're more involved. So we don't have that direct connection anymore. But we do have the meetings that Debbie was talking about. We have that sort of connection and coordination continually with the school district. And so if there's a threat that we know of, we come together on that very quickly, and we address that very well, actually, to get ahead of things before they happen. And then now we are exploring ways to, as they expand their gang outreach, youth intervention type work, especially with that grant funding we're going to give them, it'll provide another tool for us too to also make referrals, to communicate both ways on those things. So if we interact with the youth in the community who we think is at high risk or making bad decisions, we'll be able to connect with the school district and share that sort of information and hopefully guide them into some focused resources through the school district. But you're right, it's not the same anymore without the officers in the schools, but there still is a pretty strong relationship there and ongoing coordination and communication happening.
Any additional questions for the chief? Councilor Gonzalez.
Talking about relationships, also the transit, school district, of course, Marion County, the state, if there's any other relationships that either are lacking that we can help. This isn't just on you, Sheriff, and the staff here. I mean, we can reach out to the commissioners. We can reach out to the Salem school board members. We can, those are the counterparts we should be reaching out to. So then we can start engaging that talk and get, maybe talk about those resources. So let us know how we can help. And I hear a lot about Northeast Salem, but I asked my son maybe like 8-9 years ago, because between him and my daughter, my older two, they went to pretty much school in every part of town, West Salem, South Salem, North Salem. And as I started to see this drug problem happening, I asked him, JJ, I want to ask you a question. I go, you've been to most schools, especially most of these high schools. You have friends everywhere. Where is the drug use higher, right? Because I'm assuming a lot of these issues stem from drug use, drug runners, the drugs coming in through I-5, because of Northeast Salem. Like the sheriff said, there's a lot of activity here. Why? Because we're a funnel. We're an important part of that for organized crime. And he said, West Salem is highest use of drugs, according to him. Then I go, what's second? South Salem. Okay, what's third? North Salem. And these organized crime, they're smart. They're using the Latino kids in Northeast Salem to sell drugs to everywhere else. So I don't know what's going to stop it, but we sort of have to look at the demand side too, because as we're going and just, these cartels, these organized crime are taking advantage of the youth that we know are being taken advantage of because of the lack of resources, because of poverty, because social media. There's a lifestyle that gets promoted on there. So that's something I just wanted to throw in there because it's always missing from this conversation.
We don't mean to leave it out of the conversation. So that's why the GVPA is so important also, because we're not talking about drug dealing and drug use. We're talking about shootings. Where are shootings actually occurring? They can and do occur all over our city. Think of the shooting that happened right after our kickoff meeting and where that occurred. So they do happen all across the city in different areas. It was 65% of the shootings are more concentrated. So it's just a higher risk area. It's not that that's the only place they happen. But it helps us make decisions on where we invest our resources. And as far as the demographics of folks that are involved as well. And the breakdown in the GVPA will show kind of the motive behind these shootings, the motive, the factors that led up to the shootings, and a drug dispute was one of the smaller numbers in there. To be honest with you, it was other things involved: interpersonal conflict over, a dating relationship or a gang or group conflict. There's other things that are causing these disputes to happen. Besides just a drug dispute. And so we have to be real careful about making the assumption of what's actually fueling the violence itself, not to diminish the drug problem. I think that's important as well. But if you're talking only about community violence, you have to really pay attention to the data and go after the drivers for the violence, the shootings, what's causing the trigger to be pulled. Again, trust me, I know the drug influence is a factor that's contributing, but not necessarily the primary motivator for every shooting is not a drug offense.
Councilor Phillips.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Chief Hoy. Thank you to all the partners and staff members that brought this data to us, and for all the partners in the community that are, working with us in terms of the DA's office and the sheriff's office in the county. I just wanted to put out there that I appreciate the information that was presented tonight. I really appreciated the framework that Chief Womack led us off with in terms of this isn't about being hard on crime or soft on crime. This is about being smart. I really appreciate that framework. I guess my one thought would be in this resource-constrained budgetary cycle that we find ourselves in, man, I would really like us to try to find ways to advocate, from the state government. Maybe this is a position they could help us with. Long terms, it sounds like it's the coordinator position that we've talked about previously. Just seems really important, and getting some sort of long-term funding established would be great. So I would look to our state leaders on that front. We all know that a payment in lieu of taxes is something that this community is widely in support of. And then just a couple more comments. One, I think Councilor Gonzalez's point on drugs is true. I know that it isn't about the issue tonight in terms of the Community Violence Reduction Initiative, but it's important for people to understand. Let's talk about something less controversial in the state of Oregon, like marijuana use. Marijuana use is broadly the same amongst all demographics. Doesn't matter the color of your skin, the nationality you come from, it's always been about 14%. So it's just important to really take that human-based approach in mind when thinking about these things so that we don't oversimplify or overcomplicate that. And then in terms of this being a public health issue, yeah, absolutely. You know, in the last couple years, it's you know, gun violence has been the #1 or #2 cause of death for children between the age of 1 and 19. So this is a big deal, and I know that we're tackling a specific part of it tonight. You know, we're trying to focus on that, but it absolutely is a public health thing. I get my sense as just one person who works in the Salem Hospital emergency room is that, you know, I would love more tools and screening options to do. So I'm glad to hear that Salem Health is there and part of this process. You know, we want to make a difference in the lives of our patients every single time we care for them, and especially their family members as well. So if there's something that, you know, I could do as a doc moving forward, I'd love to learn more about that. And I just wanted to commend you know, that view that this is a public health issue as well. I agree. And that is the data that I'm tracking as well. Because like I said, gun violence is either the #1 or #2 cause of death for children between the age of 1 and 19.
Thank you, Counselor. Chief, do you have anything else for us?
No, if there's no more comments or questions, I think that covers it.
All right. Well, thank you. I think this has been really informative. I appreciate it. And with that, we're adjourned.